Hello. Today General Hospital will reveal Drew's survival after the first attempt on his life had been nothing short of miraculous, and for a brief moment, it seemed as though the worst had passed. He had endured hours of delicate surgery, his body sustained by machines, his fate hanging in the balance while skilled surgeons and determined nurses worked tirelessly to save him. When he was finally transferred to recovery, still fragile but stable, relief swept through those who loved him most. Family and friends, exhausted from days of fear, allowed themselves to hope. The doctors spoke of progress, of careful monitoring and eventual rehabilitation. Alexis, Liz, and others close to him clung to those words, believing that Drew's path forward, though difficult, was finally within reach. Yet in a world shadowed by betrayal, hidden agendas, and ruthless ambition, peace was often an illusion. The fact that Drew had survived the first attack was not only a miracle, it was also an insult to those who had orchestrated his downfall. Whoever had pulled the strings behind the original shooting had no intention of leaving their task unfinished. Survival only made Drew a greater threat, a reminder that loose ends had not been tied and secrets not yet buried. As word spread of his recovery, whispers began to circulate in the underworld that Drew's unfinished death was a stain on someone's reputation. The kind of people capable of commissioning such violence could not tolerate the appearance of failure. To them, Drew living on was not a testament to resilience but a challenge that demanded a swift, brutal correction. The day of the second attempt began with the quietest of intentions. Scout, Drew's young daughter, had been desperate to see her father. The trauma of his shooting had weighed heavily on her tender heart, and while Alexis and Liz agonized over whether it was wise to let her visit, they ultimately believed the hospital to be the safest place imaginable. The halls were patrolled, visitors screened, and his room watched closely by staff. What harm could come from letting a child see her father briefly, to give him comfort, even if he was still too weak to respond? For Scout, the anticipation of stepping into her father's room was filled with innocence. She clutched a small handmade gift, something she had worked on quietly, pouring into it the love and longing that words could not express. She imagined his eyes opening, his smile returning, even if faint, just to know she was there beside him. But as often happens in stories marked by darkness, joy is fragile. Just as Scout entered the room, the air shifted. A presence slipped into the sterile safety of the ward like a shadow given flesh. The sound of footsteps was almost imperceptible, the figure's movement precise, as if every gesture had been rehearsed. Scout, still too young to understand the true magnitude of danger but instinctively aware of its presence, froze. Her wide eyes caught the glint of determination in the stranger's gaze, an expression void of hesitation or humanity. The intruder moved with lethal intent, each step bringing him closer to Drew's vulnerable body. Drew, unconscious and defenseless, could not sense the threat, but Scout could. The assassin had timed it perfectly. The bustle of the nurses had momentarily shifted elsewhere, the corridors oddly quiet, and his path unchallenged. He raised his weapon, ready to finish the job once and for all. But what he had not anticipated was the presence of the child. Scout's gasp, a sharp, broken sound filled with fear pierced the silence and shattered his concentration. In that instant, the roles shifted. The little girl who had come only to offer her father love became a witness, her innocent gaze burning into the assassin's plan like a spotlight. To kill Drew now meant killing in front of her, leaving behind a traumatized survivor whose testimony could unravel everything. The moment of hesitation was brief, but in that fraction of time, Scout realized the danger with startling clarity. Her heart pounded as adrenaline surged, and instinct overrode fear. She bolted toward the door, clutching her gift still, the image of the would-be killer etched permanently into her young mind. Behind her, the assassin cursed under his breath, torn between his mission and the unforeseen complication. He had planned for guards, for alarms, for cameras, but not for the unflinching eyes of a child who had seen him, truly seen him, in a way that could never be undone. What had been meant as a clinical execution turned chaotic. The attempt on Drew's life, meant to be swift and silent, now carried the weight of exposure. Scout, shaken and trembling, was quickly swept up by hospital staff, her cries drawing attention, her terror undeniable. Yet within her fear lay something crucial: memory. She had seen his face, his build, his eyes. And though she was only a child, what she carried could break open the entire conspiracy. The hospital transformed from a place of recovery into a crime scene once more, alarms echoing, security swarming, and investigators converging. For Anna, Dante, and Chase, this second attempt confirmed the scale of the threat. Drew's survival was no longer just a matter of medical resilience, it was now a battlefield of secrecy, power, and fear. Scout had become an unintended witness, and with that came peril far greater than anyone anticipated. Protecting Drew was no longer enough. Now, they had to shield his daughter, the girl whose courage and sharp eyes might hold the key to identifying the assassin. While knowing full well that the forces behind this campaign would stop at nothing to silence her. In the chaos that followed, Scout managed to escape, her small legs carrying her down the hospital corridor as fast as fear would allow. But she carried with her something far heavier than any child should bear. The image of the would-be assassin, the sharp contours of his face, the cold glint in his eyes, the way his hands moved with deadly precision was now seared into her memory. That single moment transformed her from a child who only wanted to see her father into the sole witness of an attempted murder. What she had seen could not be erased, and it gave her a dangerous importance she never asked for. The hospital, which only moments before had been filled with the ordinary rhythm of medical routines, was thrown into turmoil. Alarms rang, staff rushed in every direction, security swarmed, and the sterile halls became a crime scene once again. Drew's room, meant to be a sanctuary of healing, became the epicenter of another violent storm. News of the incident spread like wildfire, and the PCPD wasted no time in stepping in. This was no longer just a matter of medical recovery, it was now a case of criminal urgency. Anna, seasoned and relentless, took command of the investigation. She knew from the precision of the attack that this was not a random act of violence. No petty criminal could have bypassed the hospital's security, moved through restricted zones, and chosen the perfect moment to strike. This level of orchestration spoke of something far larger, a shadowy force determined to erase Drew from existence once and for all. The brazenness of the attempt made it clear. Someone powerful was pulling the strings, someone with resources, someone unafraid to send killers into one of the most heavily monitored places in Port Charles. Recognizing the gravity of the threat, Dante and Chase pushed aside their personal conflicts and committed themselves fully to the case. This was no time for divided loyalties or lingering resentments. Both detectives understood that one misstep could mean Drew's death, and now, with Scout as a witness, the stakes had doubled. Protecting her became as critical as protecting Drew. Their investigation began immediately, canvassing hospital security footage, questioning staff, and tracing every entry and exit point. Still, the chilling truth lingered. If the assassin had been bold enough to walk into a hospital once, what was stopping him or his employers from trying again? For Scout, the weight of what she carried was unbearable. She had not asked to be a witness, and yet her memory might hold the only clues capable of unmasking the culprit. Every adult around her understood the danger. A child in possession of such knowledge instantly became a target. Willow, who had only recently been granted temporary custody of Scout while Drew was incapacitated, found herself thrust into an impossible position. Her maternal instincts urged her to shield Scout from the trauma, to protect her innocence, to reassure her that everything would be all right. But another reality loomed. Law enforcement needed information. The images imprinted in Scout's mind might be the only way to identify the assassin before he struck again. The conflict tore at Willow, as she stood at the crossroads of safeguarding a child's psyche and aiding a desperate investigation. Alexis felt the torment just as deeply. As Scout's grandmother, she was consumed by worry, knowing all too well the ruthless lengths criminals would go to in order to silence witnesses. Scout's innocence did not exempt her from the rules of such a dark world. If anything, it made her more vulnerable. Alexis understood that the people who wanted Drew dead would not hesitate to turn their sights on his daughter if they sensed she could unravel their plans. The mere thought filled her with dread, a gnawing fear that no amount of legal expertise or protective walls could fully erase. Her mind raced with legal strategies, custody concerns, and protective measures, but beneath it all lay a grandmother's simple, raw terror for a child who had seen too much. As Anna's investigation pressed forward, the team became acutely aware that Scout was both a key and a liability. The more they depended on her memory, the more they exposed her to danger. What she remembered could light the path toward the assassin, but it could also paint a target on her back. Every step from here on out had to be measured with precision, because the enemy had already proven how far they were willing to go. Drew's fight for survival was no longer just his own. It had become a battle that pulled in his daughter, his family, and the law enforcement officers sworn to protect them. And with each passing moment, the storm around them grew darker, more menacing, and more relentless. Piece by piece, the larger picture began to take shape, and with it came a clarity that was as terrifying as it was illuminating. Rumors spread rapidly that Jens Sidwell's shadowy hand was involved, his name surfacing again and again in whispers tied to violence, manipulation, and covert dealings. For those who had watched Sidwell maneuver over the years, the connection was hardly surprising. His history was littered with orchestrated chaos, political backroom deals, and the kind of carefully veiled threats that ensured silence from anyone who dared to question him. What stood out most now was the undeniable fact that Drew had become a repeated target. This was not random. Two assassination attempts within days were a testament to determination of Sidwell or his allies to eliminate Drew at any cost. It pointed toward a hidden truth, something dangerous that Drew had stumbled upon or carried with him, a secret so explosive that men like Sidwell would risk everything to keep it buried. Jason, still trapped in the tangled web of his mission at the Five Poppies, felt the weight of his friend's peril pressing against his conscience. Every moment he spent away from Port Charles was a moment lost, another chance for the unseen enemy to strike. His instincts screamed at him that Drew might not survive a third attempt. Jason's world had always been one of calculated risks and unflinching resolve, but this time was different. It wasn't just about protecting a friend, it was about unraveling a conspiracy that seemed to stretch across international borders, clandestine organizations, and into the very heart of Port Charles itself. He knew the urgency. If he didn't identify the hand behind the attack soon, he might return only to find that the battle had been lost. Meanwhile, Carly, Nina, and Portia found themselves unwilling participants in a whirlpool of intrigue they could neither control nor fully comprehend. Clues that initially seemed unrelated began to interlock, revealing a web of clandestine hospital contracts, concealed transactions, and backroom alliances forged in secrecy. What had once been viewed as isolated lapses or administrative oddities now looked like deliberate cover-ups designed to shield powerful figures. Portia, immersed in the hospital's operations, realized with growing dread that the institution she worked so hard to uphold might itself be compromised. Nina, ever perceptive of the shifts in power and influence, began to sense the undercurrents of corruption bleeding into every corner. Carly, with her instinct for survival and her deep ties to Jason and Drew, pieced together connections others might have missed. Recognizing that the events were not accidents but the deliberate moves of people playing a game at a scale most could not imagine. The second attempt on Drew's life shattered any illusion of safety. If killers could walk through hospital walls undetected, if they could reach into a place supposed to be secure, then the web of protection around Drew was nothing but paper. That failure made one thing brutally clear. The forces orchestrating this violence were not just determined, they were deeply embedded, capable of bending rules, breaking systems, and bypassing barriers. It became apparent that Port Charles was no longer simply dealing with a personal vendetta against Drew, it was dealing with a coordinated network of influence that reached into some of the city's most trusted institutions. Anna, seasoned by years of navigating deception, corruption, and espionage, recognized the magnitude of the storm before her. Every instinct told her this was no longer about one man's survival but about dismantling an operation designed to conceal truths too dangerous to expose. She poured herself into the investigation, scrutinizing every word Scout managed to recall, analyzing even the smallest inconsistencies in hospital records, and mapping out the trails that most others would overlook. Her sharp mind caught connections others dismissed, a security lapse here, an unexplained financial transaction there, and the sudden silence of staff who once spoke freely. It became clear that the attempt on Drew's life was not only about silencing him but about safeguarding a secret so volatile that its revelation could topple individuals and institutions alike. The deeper it went, the clearer it became that Drew was not merely a victim of circumstance. He was the holder of a key, a man who unknowingly carried within him the knowledge or perhaps the evidence that could shatter the foundation of the powerful. That was why he had been targeted once, and why he had been targeted again. His very existence posed a threat to those who thrived in the shadows. If he lived, If he recovered, if he remembered or revealed what he knew, then those who had long controlled events from behind the curtain would face exposure. What had begun as a medical crisis transformed into a political and criminal saga of the highest order. Drew's recovery bed was no longer just a place of healing, it was a battlefield. Around him, lives and loyalties were tested. Around him, the city's dark machinery began to reveal itself in ways too dangerous to ignore. And with every passing day, Anna's realization grew sharper. Protecting Drew was about more than saving a man's life. It was about confronting a secret that had the power to bring the most powerful of Port Charles crashing down into the light. What had first appeared to be a matter of survival, brutal shooting of Drew and the long, fragile road of recovery that followed was now unraveling into something far more complex, far more sinister, and far more dangerous than anyone had anticipated. The second attempt on his life was not simply an escalation of violence, it was a declaration. It told Anna, Dante Chase, and every ally still fighting for Drew's safety that the forces aligned against him were not operating on impulse or desperation. This was methodical, deliberate, and relentless. Whoever had ordered Drew's death was determined to see it carried out, and the failed attempts were not setbacks, they were warnings. Each failure seemed to increase the urgency and the willingness of the conspirators to take greater risks. The hospital itself, a place meant to heal, had been breached not once but twice. To Anna, this alone confirmed the terrifying truth. The conspiracy was no longer operating from the outside. It had infiltrated the very core of Port Charles institutions. The whispers around Jen Sidwell became louder with each passing day. He was no stranger to manipulation, no stranger to violence masked as business, and no stranger to leaving ruin in his wake. For years, Sidwell had cultivated an image of untouchable influence, moving freely between legal power and illegal control, blurring the lines so effectively that few dared to challenge him. Yet every thread of evidence seemed to lead back to him, and the pattern was unmistakable. Drew was not targeted simply because he was vulnerable. He was targeted because he knew or was believed to know something that Sidwell and his allies could not risk being exposed. Perhaps it was a detail Drew had uncovered during his military pass, a secret buried in WSB files, or even knowledge tied to financial or political deals concealed under layers of false paperwork. Whatever it was, Sidwell had marked him as dangerous, and in Sidwell's world, threats were neutralized without hesitation. Jason, thousands of miles away at the Five Poppies, felt the tightening noose from afar. He had faced assassins, spies, and syndicates before, but rarely had the personal collided with the professional so brutally. His loyalty to Drew had never wavered, and every report of a new attempt on his friend's life tore at him. He knew Sidwell's reach was long, perhaps even stretching into the same world Jason himself was navigating overseas. Each coded message, each whisper about assassins hired to finish a job, only confirmed what his instincts told him: time was running out. Jason was haunted by the thought that he might return too late, that Drew's third and final attempt would succeed before he could intervene. His mission became twofold: to dismantle the network abroad while piecing together enough information to cut off Sidwell's reach at its source. Back in Port Charles, the collateral damage spread like cracks through glass. Carly found herself drawn deeper into the vortex, her instincts pulling her toward the truth no matter how dangerous it became. She had long been forced to navigate the delicate balance between loyalty, survival, and exposure, and this situation was no different. For her, protecting Drew was more than friendship, it was about shielding her family, her children, and everyone tethered to the chaos Sidwell had unleashed. Nina, too, though often at odds with Carly, could not ignore the implications. The hospital, her stake in its reputation, and her ties to those working within it all placed her squarely in the path of fallout. Every revelation hinted that the corruption was not external but embedded in the very structure of the hospital itself. If contracts had been manipulated, if money had flowed from hidden accounts to silence staff, then the rot was systemic. Portia, whose career and ethics bound her to the hospital, felt the sting of betrayal most sharply. She had dedicated herself to healing, only to realize that the institution she trusted might have been weaponized as a front for darker dealings. Each suspicious entry in medical records, each unexplained financial report, seemed to suggest that someone had been using the hospital not only as a place of cover but as an active component of the conspiracy. Her position forced her into danger as she weighed whether to expose what she suspected, knowing full well that whistleblowers rarely walked away unscathed. Anna, however, was the one piecing the puzzle together with relentless focus. She listened to Scout's trembling voice recounting what she had seen, careful to extract details without overwhelming the child. A scar, a height, a mannerism of it mattered. She compared those details to known associates, cross-referencing hospital surveillance, interrogating staff who hesitated too long before answering. The deeper she dug, the more she recognized the subtle fingerprints of Sidwell's influence, falsified logs, erased footage, staff reassigned without explanation. Each breadcrumb led to another, not toward clarity but toward a labyrinth of deceit that stretched across Port Charles and beyond. What became chillingly clear to Anna was that Drew was never just a victim. He was the fulcrum on which this entire secret balanced. His survival threatened to tilt the scales, to expose what powerful figures had spent years burying. His knowledge, perhaps even something he did not consciously realize he possessed, was dangerous enough that men like Sidwell would sacrifice pawns, break into hospitals, and risk public exposure to eliminate him. That knowledge was a key, and as long as Drew lived, that key remained in play. The second attempt on Drew's life, instead of silencing him, had set off a chain reaction. It revealed the weakness of the protective barriers around him, the reach of the conspirators, and the vulnerability of those closest to him. It turned his daughter into a target, his friends into suspects, and his hospital room into a battlefield. More importantly, it proved that this was not merely about Drew's personal survival. It was about a secretome that, if revealed, could bring Sidwell and others like him crashing down, exposing corruption, manipulation, and hidden crimes that had thrived in the shadows for far too long. Drew's fight for life had become the fight for truth. Every person around him, Scout with her fragile memory, Jason with his desperate mission, Carly, Nina, and Portia pulled unwillingly into the web. Alexis, torn between law and love, was now entangled in a battle much larger than themselves. Anna, more than anyone, knew the stakes. If she succeeded, the truth might finally surface. If she failed, Drew would not survive a third attempt, and with his death, the key to dismantling the conspiracy would vanish forever. The storm was no longer approaching. It had arrived, and its force threatened to consume them all. While children like Scout found themselves unwillingly pulled into a battlefield designed and controlled by adults, the machinery of power worked tirelessly to conceal truths and manipulate outcomes. The innocence of a child, meant to be safeguarded from such horrors, had been shattered by the cold stare of an assassin and the realization that her father's life hung in the balance of forces far beyond her comprehension. Scout should have been thinking about school, friends, and childhood joys, yet instead she became a living witness to a conspiracy that reached deep into Port Charles. Her memory of that moment was both a blessing and a curse. It could unlock the path to justice, but it also painted a target on her back that no one could ignore. Around her, women like Willow, Liz, and Alexis understood the gravity of what was unfolding. Each had her own role to play, but together they became the last line of defense, a fragile shield against dangers that were closing in on all sides. Willow, newly tasked with temporary custody of Scout, carried the burden of protecting her not just from the physical dangers lurking in the shadows but from the emotional weight of what she had seen. She wanted to shield Scout from trauma, to preserve what innocence remained, yet at the same time, she knew the police and investigators needed every detail the little girl could recall. To deny that testimony was to risk Drew's life. To extract it was to risk damaging Scout beyond repair. It was an impossible balance that left Willow lying awake at night, torn between compassion and necessity. Liz, with her steady resilience and instinct for nurturing, became both a caregiver and a strategist. She knew too well how the corridors of the hospital had become hunting grounds, how the walls that should have offered protection had instead been breached by cold ambition. Her role was to keep Scout safe inside those walls and to fight back against the idea that the hospital itself was compromised beyond salvation. Her knowledge of protocols, staff, and operations gave her a vantage point that no one else possessed, yet it also placed her in danger. If corruption was running through the veins of General Hospital, Liz risked drawing the attention of those who would prefer silence over exposure. Alexis, always armed with legal acuity and a grandmother's love, found herself consumed by fear. She understood better than anyone the ruthlessness of those who sought to eliminate Drew, and by extension, anyone who could reveal the truth. She had spent her life navigating power, politics, and the fragility of justice, but this was different. This was family. Scout's involvement was not theoretical, it was visceral, immediate, and deeply personal. Alexis knew that the law could protect in theory, but in practice, it was often too slow, too fragile, to counter the immediacy of violence. Her thoughts raced constantly between courtrooms and back alleys, between custody papers and assassination attempts. Each scenario reminding her that one wrong step could cost her granddaughter her life. And yet, despite their love, despite their courage, all of them knew that emotion alone could not stop what was coming. The assassin's persistence, the power of Sidwell's network, the brazen breach of Safetite, these were not the acts of someone who could be frightened away by courage or swayed by appeals to morality. They were the acts of people who would not rest until Drew was silenced. That knowledge cast a shadow over every decision, forcing everyone involved to confront uncomfortable truths. How many chances did Drew realistically have left? Would the third attempt succeed where the first two had failed? Was his life destined to end not because of weakness in his body but because of the relentless determination of his enemies? The looming question, the one none of them dared voice aloud, was even darker. If the truth Drew carried was so destructive that powerful figures would risk everything to suppress it, was exposing that truth worth the cost? Would it save Port Charles, or would it destroy everyone he loved in the process? For Alexis, Liz, Willow, and all those orbiting this crisis, the answer was not clear. What was clear, however, was that the family was being tested in ways that would either fracture them or forge them stronger than ever before. Drew's future no longer depended solely on his physical recovery. It was no longer just a matter of surgeries, medications, and rehabilitation. His survival now hinged on the speed and precision of Anna's investigation, the ability of law enforcement to outmaneuver an enemy that had already shown itself capable of breaching sacred places, and the courage of a child who had been forced to see what no child should ever witness. Scout's memory, her resilience, and her willingness to recount what she saw could hold the key to breaking this case wide open. But depending on her testimony meant placing unbearable weight on shoulders too small, and everyone knew it. What remained was unity. Only if those who loved Drew and Scout came together, setting aside personal rivalries, past grudges, and conflicting loyalties, could they stand a chance against the darkness that was consuming them. The enemy was faceless, powerful, and deeply entrenched, but the light they carried, fragile though it seemed, was the only hope of breaking through. Whether it would be enough remained uncertain. Each day that passed without resolution meant another day closer to a third attempt, another chance for the shadows to strike. And as the family stood watch over Drew, their hearts heavy with both love and fear, they all silently asked themselves the same haunting question: how much longer could they hold the line before the storm finally swallowed them whole?